The day the aliens came, humanity celebrated. People danced in the streets of every city on Earth. They cried tears of joy and held their children up to the sky as the massive ships descended through the clouds. After thousands of years of wondering if they were alone in the universe, humans finally had their answer. They were not alone, and the beings who found them seemed kind. The Galactic Concordat called themselves friends. They were an alliance of 12 ancient species who had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. Their ambassador, a tall creature with silver skin and 4 arms, spoke to the United Nations with words that sounded like poetry. He promised technology that would end disease. He promised ships that would carry humans to distant worlds. He promised that Earth would join a family of civilizations stretching across the galaxy. Ambassador Yara Chen signed the Unity Accords on behalf of humanity. She was a brilliant woman who had spent her whole life dreaming of the stars. When she pressed her thumb to the document, billions of people watched on their screens. She smiled through her tears, believing she had given humanity its greatest gift. No one understood what they had actually agreed to. The document was thousands of pages long, written in a language humans had only begun to learn. The Concordat translators assured everyone that the terms were standard. They said the phrase, "labor integration protocols," simply meant that humans would have opportunities to work alongside other species. They said it was an honor. 5 years later, humanity learned the truth. The Concordat was dying. Their populations had grown old and tired over thousands of years. They needed workers. They needed servants. They needed slaves. And they had found the perfect species on a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy. Humans were young, strong, and adaptable. They could survive in environments that would kill other beings. They bred quickly and learned fast. They were, in the cold language of Concordat economists, it's an excellent resource. When Earth's governments realized what they had signed, they protested. They demanded changes to the treaty. They threatened to withdraw from the agreement entirely. The Concordat responded with fire. 30-7 cities burned in a single afternoon. The attacks were precise and terrifying. The aliens did not destroy everything. They destroyed just enough to send a message. They killed just enough people to prove that resistance was impossible. Then they broadcast a simple statement to every screen on the planet. The Unity Accords are binding. Compliance is required. Further resistance will result in further correction. The Great Exodus began within a year. Humans were loaded onto ships and scattered across the galaxy. The Concordat had learned from history that slaves were dangerous when they stayed together. So they separated families on purpose. They sent parents to one world and children to another. They made sure that humans on different planets could not communicate with each other on the mining world of Verith Prime. Humans dug for precious metals in tunnels filled with toxic gas. They wore thin masks that barely worked and died by the hundreds every month. The Cathari overseers, insect-like creatures with no understanding of mammalian pain, simply ordered more workers to replace the dead. On the pleasure worlds of the Sindari hegemony, humans served as entertainment for the rich and powerful. They danced and sang and suffered in ways that the Sindari found amusing. Those who refused were made into examples. Those who complied were rewarded with slightly less cruel treatment. On 1,000 other worlds, humans built and cleaned and carried and died. They became the invisible foundation of Concordat civilization. The other species stopped noticing them after a while. Humans were simply there. Like furniture or tools, Earth itself became what the Concordat called a protected historical preserve. A small population of humans was allowed to remain, carefully monitored and controlled. Tourists from other worlds came to observe them in their natural habitat. They took pictures and made comments about how primitive humans looked. They did not see the hatred in human eyes because they did not think to look. 200 years passed. Generations were born and died in chains. Children grew up knowing nothing but service and pain. The stories of Earth became legends, then myths, then half-forgotten dreams. Many humans began to believe that this was simply how things were meant to be. The Concordat had won, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. But not everyone forgot. Not everyone surrendered. In the deep places of the galaxy, In the mines and factories and servant quarters, where no overseer bothered to watch too closely, humans began to whisper. They developed codes that looked like random numbers but actually carried messages. They used mathematics, the one universal language that the Concordat had never bothered to restrict. After all, what harm could equations do? The Resistance called themselves the Unbroken. They had no central headquarters, no official leaders, no army. They were simply a network of whispers passing from one human to another across thousands of light years. They shared information. They shared hope. And slowly, carefully, they began to plan. Some of them worked in shipyards where the Concordat built its mighty vessels. They studied everything they could and memorized designs that their masters thought too complex for human minds. Others worked in the homes of powerful officials, listening to conversations they were supposed to ignore. A few, the bravest and most clever, managed to steal small amounts of resources. A little metal here, some electronic components there, nothing that would be missed. Nothing that would raise suspicion. The plan would take generations. The humans who started it knew they would not live to see it completed. They did not care. They were planting seeds for their grandchildren to harvest. On the mining colony of Sigma Draconis IV. An old woman named Alina Vasquez worked the same tunnels she had worked since childhood. Her hands were scarred from decades of labor. Her lungs were damaged from breathing poison air. She had watched her husband die in a collapse and her children be taken to other worlds she would never see. By every measure, her life had been nothing but suffering. But Alina Vasquez had a secret. Every night, when the guards were not watching, she scratched symbols into the walls of her cell. They looked like random marks to anyone who did not know better. They were actually coordinates and dates encoded in a mathematical system that only the Unbroken understood. A younger worker named Thomas saw the marks one evening. He was new to the mines, transferred from another world just months ago. But he recognized the code. His grandmother had taught him before she died. He memorized the message and said nothing to Alina. She did not know him. And it was safer if they never spoke. But that night he passed the message to another worker, who passed it to another, who passed it to another. The message traveled across the galaxy through 1,000 secret channels. It carried coordinates and a date. It carried a promise that had been building for 200 years. The day of reckoning was coming. And when it arrived, the Concordat would learn what humanity was truly capable of. Alina Vasquez died 3 months later from a lung infection that the overseers did not bother to treat. She never knew if her message reached its destination. She never knew that her small act of defiance would help change the course of history. But somewhere in the darkness between stars, ships were being built. Weapons were being designed. And millions of humans who had never known freedom were preparing to fight for it. The chains were about to break. The Concordat believed they understood humans completely. They had studied the species for 200 years. They had observed humans working, sleeping, eating, and dying. They had written thousands of reports about human behavior, human biology, and human psychology. Every important official in the galaxy had access to these reports. None of them thought to look inside the asteroids. For over a century, humans had been ordered to mine the rocky bodies floating through space. The work was dangerous and lonely. Ships would dock with an asteroid, and teams of workers would spend months hollowing it out, extracting valuable metals and minerals. The overseers rarely visited these remote locations. They simply checked the shipment manifests and confirmed that enough resources were being delivered. They never noticed that 10% of every shipment disappeared before it reached Concordat hands. They never wondered why certain asteroids took longer to mine than others. They never imagined that inside those hollowed rocks, humans were building something that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The Resistance had 7 commanders spread across the galaxy. They had never met in person. They communicated through a network of coded messages that took months to travel from one end of Concordat space to the other. But they trusted each other completely because they had no other choice. Commander Marcus Stone led the military arm of the Unbroken. He was born on a Cathari industrial world, the child of 2 workers who died from exhaustion before he turned 10 years old. He had survived by being useful, by learning everything he could about machines and weapons and tactics. The Cathari thought he was simply a talented mechanic. They did not know that he was memorizing their weaknesses, studying their patrol patterns, and quietly recruiting every human worker who showed a spark of defiance. Dr. Damara Okonkwo was a scientist who should have won prizes and written famous papers. Instead, she was forced to design weapons for Concordat military forces. For 40 years, she pretended to work slowly and make frequent mistakes. Her overseers thought she was less intelligent than she appeared. They did not know that she was secretly developing entirely new technologies based on principles the Concordat had never considered. While they focused on making their existing weapons bigger and stronger, she was thinking in ways they could not imagine. The third leader was known only as the Architect. No one knew this person's real name or location, or even what they looked like. The Architect had somehow built an information network spanning 12,000 worlds. Every human who cleaned an office or served meals to officials became a potential spy. Every whispered conversation in the halls of power eventually found its way to the Architect's ears. The plan they created together was called the Prometheus Doctrine. In ancient human mythology, Prometheus was a being who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. The Unbroken intended to do the same thing on a galactic scale. The date they chose was the 200th anniversary of the Unity Accords. On that day, humans across the galaxy were expected to participate in celebrations honoring the treaty that had enslaved them. Concordat officials looked forward to seeing their servants smile and sing and pretend to be grateful. They had no idea what was actually being prepared. When the moment arrived, the galaxy changed forever. On 17 different worlds, human workers suddenly produced weapons that had been hidden for decades. On 43 mining stations, ships emerged from asteroids where they had been secretly constructed. On hundreds of military bases, humans who had worked as cleaners and cooks revealed that they had spent years sabotaging critical systems. The attacks were perfectly coordinated. Communications networks failed. Power plants shut down. Defense systems refused to activate. The Concordat military, the most powerful force in the galaxy, found itself blind and confused in 100 different locations at once. But Commander Stone knew that military victory alone was not possible. The Concordat had too many ships, too many soldiers, too many resources. The Unbroken could hurt them, but they could not defeat them through force. They needed something more. The Architect provided it. While explosions lit up the skies of Concordat worlds, a different kind of attack was happening in the information networks. Every screen in the galaxy suddenly displayed the same images. They showed human children being torn from their mothers' arms. They showed workers dying in mines, while overseers watched without concern. They showed the mass graves on 100 different planets, each one containing thousands of bodies the Concordat had always controlled. What their citizens knew about the human situation, they called it labor integration and presented it as a mutual benefit. Many ordinary citizens of the 12 species genuinely believed that humans were being helped, not harmed. Now they saw the truth. 200 million humans had died in the first decade of the program alone. Families had been separated as policy, not accident. Breeding programs had been established to produce more workers. Children had been taken from parents and raised to forget their own species' history. Some Concordat citizens were horrified. Others refused to believe what they were seeing. They called it propaganda and lies. But the evidence was overwhelming. Documents from Concordat archives. Testimony from officials who had been involved. Medical records showing the true death rates in mining colonies. The 12 species that made up the Concordat began to argue among themselves. Some demanded immediate military response to crush the rebellion. Others suggested that perhaps negotiations were possible. A few quietly wondered if they had been wrong all along. Chancellor Vethos of the Sindari was not one of those who wondered. He was an old creature who had built his entire career on the labor system. He stood before the Concordat Senate and dismissed the uprising as a human tantrum that would be crushed within months. He authorized the largest military response in galactic history. What he did not know was that his personal servant, A human who had poured his drinks and organized his schedule for 15 years was watching him very carefully. This servant had never shown any sign of disloyalty. He had smiled and bowed and said, "Yes, Chancellor," thousands of times. The Chancellor had stopped noticing him years ago. The servant's eyes moved slightly, looking at a spot on the ceiling where a tiny camera had been hidden. Through that camera, the architect saw everything. Every war plan the Chancellor discussed, every strategy the military leaders proposed, every weakness they revealed in their own defenses. The Unbroken had started a war they could not win through strength alone. So they would win through intelligence, through patience, and through the Concordat's own arrogance. Across the galaxy, Marcus Stone received the latest reports from the Architects Network. The first battles had been costly. Many humans had died. Many more would die in the months to come. But they had achieved something that the Concordat thought impossible. They had proven that humans could fight back. He stood on the bridge of a ship that had been built in secret inside an asteroid, crewed by men and women who had been born as property and now called themselves soldiers. Beyond the windows, stars burned in the endless darkness. "This is just the beginning," he said to no one in particular. "They think they know what war means. They have no idea." The message went out to every cell of the Resistance, every hidden ship, every human still waiting in the shadows for their moment to act. The word was simple. The fire had been stolen from the gods. Now it was time to burn. The Battle of Proxima was supposed to end the war. The Concordat gathered the largest fleet ever assembled and sent it to crush the human rebellion in a single overwhelming attack. 3,000 warships faced a human force of just 400 vessels. The outcome seemed certain. It was a slaughter. 70% of the human fleet was destroyed in less than 6 hours. Ships that had taken decades to build in secret were torn apart by weapons fire. Thousands of soldiers who had dreamed of freedom died in the cold darkness of space. The survivors fled in scattered groups, their communications disrupted, their command structure shattered. High Chancellor Vethos announced victory to the Concordat Senate. He promised that the remaining rebels would be hunted down within weeks. He called for celebrations across the galaxy. He believed the war was over. He was very wrong. Commander Marcus Stone had expected to lose at Proxima. He had sent his fleet into that battle knowing most of them would not return. It was a sacrifice designed to achieve one purpose: to make the Concordat believe they had won. While the enemy celebrated, the surviving human ships scattered across the galaxy and disappeared. They did not retreat to hidden bases or regroup for another large battle. Instead, they became ghosts. They became nightmares. The Concordat military was designed to fight wars against other organized forces. They knew how to face enemy fleets, capture planets, and hold territory. They had no experience fighting an enemy that refused to stand still. Human ships appeared without warning at supply stations and destroyed everything before help could arrive. They attacked communication relays in the middle of the night and vanished into hyperspace before dawn. They targeted fuel depots, food transports, and ammunition stores. They never fought fair because fair fights were suicide. On occupied worlds, the situation was even worse for the Concordat. Every human was a potential enemy. The servant who brought breakfast might have poisoned the food. The worker who fixed the machinery might have programmed it to fail at a critical moment. The cleaner who mopped the floors might have planted explosives under them. The Concordat responded with brutal crackdowns. They imprisoned humans by the thousands on suspicion of resistance activity. They executed entire work crews when sabotage was discovered. They installed more cameras, more guards, more restrictions. None of it worked. The humans had spent 200 years learning to survive under observation. They knew how to look loyal while plotting rebellion. They knew how to communicate without speaking and coordinate without meeting. Every crackdown just created more anger, more hatred, and more recruits for the Unbroken. Commander Stone organized his forces into what he called Phoenix cells. Each cell was small, independent, and capable of operating without any contact with the larger resistance. If one cell was destroyed, the others continued. If the Concordat captured a cell leader, that leader knew nothing about other cells. The enemy could win 100 victories and still not damage the overall rebellion. The Cathari, Admiral Scrix demanded answers. His species had been warriors for thousands of years. They had conquered dozens of civilizations. They could not understand how a species of former slaves was causing so much damage. He ordered the capture of human prisoners for interrogation. His torturers were skilled and patient. They broke bodies and minds with scientific precision. But the information they extracted was always incomplete, always outdated, always just enough to lead them into traps. One captured human colonel laughed through broken teeth when Scrix demanded to know how humans could sustain such losses and keep fighting. Other species would have surrendered long ago. Other species would have accepted defeat and begged for mercy. "You made us this way," the colonel said. "You scattered us across the galaxy to keep us weak. You put us on the harshest worlds because we could survive there when others could not. You worked us until we were strong and taught us that death was always close. You did not breed slaves, Admiral. You bred soldiers." Scrix killed the colonel himself, but the words stayed with him. He began to suspect that the Concordat had made a terrible mistake 200 years ago. They had not domesticated a useful species. They had created an enemy that would never stop fighting. Dr. Amara Okonkwo had spent her years of captivity, designing weapons for the Concordat. Now she turned her genius against them. She understood their technology better than most of their own scientists. More importantly, she understood its weaknesses. The weapons she created for the Unbroken were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. They did not simply try to be more powerful than Concordat defenses. They were designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in each enemy species. The Sindari were proud of their ability to regenerate from almost any wound. Dr. Okonkwo developed a chemical agent that disrupted their cellular repair mechanisms. Suddenly, injuries that would have healed in hours became permanent. The Cathari communicated through a biological network that linked members of their hives together. Dr. Okonkwo created devices that interfered with these signals, leaving individual Cathari confused and isolated. Each of the 12 Concordat species had evolved in specific environments with specific characteristics. Dr. Okonkwo had studied all of them. She found weaknesses they did not know they had and built weapons to exploit every single one. When reports of these new human weapons reached the Concordat Senate, the mood changed. For the first time, some officials began to use a word that had seemed impossible just months before: defeat. The humans were not just fighting back. They were fighting to win. And if they won, what would they do to the species that had enslaved them? The Concordat had shown no mercy to humanity. Would humanity show mercy in return? On the Sindari homeworld, Chancellor Vethos received a secret communication. 3 of the 12 Concordat species had begun quiet negotiations with the Unbroken. They wanted to know if there was a way out of the war. They wanted to know if surrender was possible. The alliance that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years was beginning to crack. The species that had agreed to enslave humanity together were now looking for ways to save themselves separately. Vethos read the report and felt something he had not experienced in centuries: fear. Not fear of death. Fear of something worse. Fear of being on the wrong side of history. Fear of being remembered as the leader who had led his people to destruction. He ordered his military to prepare for a massive offensive. He demanded that the wavering species recommit to the war. He threatened and promised and pleaded, but somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth. The Concordat had started this conflict, believing they were gods, dealing with insects. Now the insects were winning, and the gods did not know how to stop them. The war was far from over. The bloodiest battles were still to come. But for the first time in 200 years, humanity could see something on the horizon. Hope the Orlith were the first to break ranks. They were a quiet species, known for their philosophy and art rather than their military strength. They had joined the Concordat thousands of years ago, seeking protection from more aggressive neighbors. They had gone along with the human slavery system because refusing seemed impossible. But the Orlith had never been comfortable with what they saw. Their elders whispered that this was wrong. Their young asked questions that had no good answers. When the war began and the truth spread across the galaxy, something changed inside them. Their ambassador stood before a gathering of all 12 species and spoke words that shook the foundations of galactic politics. We told ourselves that we were civilized. We said the humans were being helped. We repeated these lies until we believed them because the truth was too ugly to face. No more. The Orolith Collective withdraws from the Concordat and from this war. Chancellor Vethos demanded punishment. He wanted the Orolith homeworld bombarded and their population enslaved alongside the humans. But 5 other species refused to support such an attack. The alliance was crumbling. Commander Stone met with Orolith representatives in a secret location between star systems. It was a tense negotiation. Humans had every reason to hate the Orolith for 2 centuries of complicity in their suffering. The Orolith had every reason to fear what humans might do to them. But Stone was not interested in revenge against those who wanted peace. He was interested in winning the war and freeing his people. He accepted the Orolith's surrender with conditions. They would pay reparations. They would testify about Concordat crimes, and they would allow human ships to pass through their space. The Orolith agreed to everything. When the agreement was announced, 3 more species began secret communications with the Unbroken. They wanted to know if similar deals were possible for them. Meanwhile, the military campaign continued. Human forces had grown stronger over 3 years of war. Liberated humans from across the galaxy joined the fight. Ships that had been built in secret emerged to replace those lost at Proxima. Allies from sympathetic species provided supplies and intelligence. The architect revealed the next phase of the war plan, Operation Homecoming. The target was Earth. For 200 years, Earth had been a symbol of Concordat power, the conquered cradle of humanity. Kept as a zoo where tourists could observe the primitive creatures in their natural habitat, liberating Earth would not just be a military victory. It would be proof that humanity had truly risen from slavery. The Concordat understood this. They had fortified the solar system with the best defenses they could build. Thousands of weapons platforms orbited every planet. A fleet of 500 warships stood ready to destroy any human force that approached. But the Concordat had made a critical mistake. They had focused all their attention on threats from outside the solar system. They had forgotten about the humans already there. The population kept on. Earth's living exhibits had never stopped being human. They had watched the stars for 200 years, waiting and hoping. They had passed down stories of freedom through generations. They had prepared in small ways that their guards never noticed. When the human fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system, they found the defenders already in chaos. Weapons platforms were firing on each other because their systems had been sabotaged by human workers. Communication networks were filled with false orders and confusing signals. Ships that should have been flying to battle stations sat motionless because their fuel had been contaminated. The battle for Earth lasted 11 days. It was the largest engagement of the entire war. Human ships fought their way through defense after defense, taking terrible losses, but never stopping. They were not fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting to go home. Commander Stone led the final assault personally. His ship was damaged in 3 places, and 2 of his bridge crew were dead when they finally broke through the last line of defense. He looked through the smoke and debris and saw something he had only known from pictures and stories: Earth. Blue and green and white. The world where his species had been born. The world that had been stolen from them. The ground assault was almost anticlimactic after the space battle. Concordat forces on Earth surrendered quickly when they realized no reinforcement was coming. Human soldiers who had never breathed unfiltered air walked through forests they had only heard about in legends. They touched grass and soil and water that flowed freely rather than being rationed by. Overseers, Marcus Stone stepped onto Earth's surface for the first time in his life. He was 57 years old. He had been fighting in one way or another since he was a child. He had killed and watched friends die and done things that would haunt him forever. He fell to his knees and picked up a handful of dirt. Around him, thousands of soldiers did the same. Some laughed. Some cried. Some simply stood in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. The The flag of the Concordat burned in front of them. It had flown over this world for 2 centuries. Now, it was ashes, but the war was not over. 5 Concordat species still fought, and the Sindari, desperate to avoid defeat, had begun doing something unforgivable. Rather than let human-populated worlds be liberated, they were destroying them. Entire colonies were being killed before human forces could arrive. News of these massacres spread through the resistance. Anger that had been controlled and directed for years threatened to become something wilder and more dangerous. Some voices called for matching cruelty. Some demanded that the Sindari homeworld be burned to ash in response. Commander Stone understood the feeling. He felt it himself. But he also knew that becoming monsters would not honor the dead. It would only mean that the Concordat had succeeded in destroying humanity's soul. Even while losing the military war, the final campaign would be different. It had to be. Humanity would either prove that they were better than their enemies, or they would become just another species capable of atrocity. An old woman stood in the ruins of a city that had been her home as a child, before she was taken to the mines. She had survived everything the Concordat had done to her. She was the only member of her family still alive. A young soldier approached her carefully and asked if liberation felt like victory. She looked at the sky where ships were already preparing. For the last phase of the war, she thought about everyone who had not survived to see this day. She thought about what still needed to be done. Not yet, she said. But it will. The battle for Earth was over. The battle for humanity's future was about to begin. The Sindari homeworld was surrounded by death. Chancellor Vethos had gathered everything his species had left and created a fortress of automated weapons and fanatical defenders. Millions of Sindari civilians huddled in underground shelters while their military prepared for a final stand. Vethos had declared a doctrine of mutual destruction. If the Sindari could not rule the galaxy, he said, they would see it burn. He had positioned weapons capable of devastating entire worlds. He had promised to use them against civilian populations if human forces attacked. Dr. Amara Okonkwo calculated the cost of a direct assault. She ran the numbers again and again, hoping to find a different answer. But mathematics did not lie. Taking the Sindari homeworld by force would cost at least 30 million human lives. And even then, there was no guarantee they could stop. Vethos from launching his final weapons, the resistance commanders gathered to discuss their options. Some argued for the assault despite the cost. The Sindari had shown no mercy to humanity. They had destroyed civilian colonies rather than let them be freed. They deserved whatever happened to them. Others spoke of waiting. A siege could eventually starve the Sindari into submission. It might take years, but it would save human lives. Commander Stone listened to every argument. Then he proposed something different. We did not start this war to become what they were, he said. We fought to prove that humans deserved to be free. If we win by destroying everything, what have we actually won? He suggested using the one weapon that the Concordat had never understood and never defended against: the truth. The architect had spent years creating hidden pathways into Sindari communication networks. Now that access was used for something that had never been tried before. A message was broadcast directly to every Sindari citizen, bypassing all government controls. The message was not a threat. It was not propaganda. It was simply a question spoken in the Sindari language by a human voice. How many of your children have to die for one old man's pride? The message continued. It showed the history of the war from the human perspective. It showed the suffering that had led to rebellion. It showed the chances for peace that Vethos had rejected. And it showed something the Sindari government had hidden from its people. Humans were not offering destruction. They were offering a choice. The species that had surrendered and negotiated with humanity had not been destroyed. The Orliths still lived on their homeworld. The other former Concordat members were rebuilding their societies in peace. Humanity wanted justice, not genocide. For the first time in their lives, ordinary Sindari citizens heard directly from their supposed enemy. What they heard did not match what their government had told them. They did not hear monsters thirsting for blood. They heard people who had suffered terribly and wanted it to stop. The response began slowly. One Sindari officer refused to fire on a civilian transport, then another. Then entire units began questioning their orders. Protests erupted in underground shelters. Citizens who had believed their government's lies suddenly found themselves wondering what else they had been told wrong. The Sindari Revolution lasted 72 hours. It was not humans who overthrew Chancellor Vithos. It was his own people. His personal guards arrested him and delivered him to the Unbroken. The automated weapon systems were shut down from the inside. The war ended not with a final apocalyptic battle, but with a surrender broadcast across every channel in the galaxy. Vethos was brought before a tribunal of species from across the galaxy. He faced charges for crimes against humanity spanning 2 centuries. He refused to speak in his own defense. He refused to show any regret. He went to his execution still believing that he had been right. Humanity could have demanded revenge. They could have called for the enslavement of their former masters. Some voices argued for exactly that. Eye for an eye, they said. Let them know what we suffered. But the majority chose a different path. The Treaty of New Geneva was signed on Earth in a city that had been rebuilt from the ruins of the original invasion. Representatives from every species in the galaxy gathered to create something new. The old Concordat was dissolved forever. In its place, a new galactic assembly was established. Every species would have equal standing. Every species would have a voice. Decisions would be made together, not imposed by the powerful on the weak. Reparations would be paid to humanity over centuries. Worlds that had been used as labor camps would be transformed into memorials and new settlements. War criminals from all species would face justice. Most importantly, slavery was abolished throughout the galaxy. Never again would one species own another. Never again would children be torn from parents to serve masters on distant worlds. Commander. Marcus Stone retired to Earth after the treaty was signed. He found a small piece of land that had belonged to his ancestors before the invasion. Records had survived somewhere, and the architect had found them as a final gift. He built a house with his own hands and learned to grow vegetables in soil that had never been poisoned by mining operations. Dr. Mara Okonkwo refused all honors and medals. She said she had not fought for recognition. She devoted the rest of her life to using her genius for healing instead of destruction. She developed medical treatments that saved millions of lives across the galaxy. When she died at 94, her funeral was attended by beings from a dozen different species. The architect disappeared after the war ended. No one ever discovered who they were or where they went. They left only a final message distributed through their network. The work continues. Stay vigilant. Freedom must be defended in every generation, across the galaxy. On every world where humans had suffered and survived, monuments rose. They were not monuments to victory or to vengeance. They were monuments to memory. Simple stones carved with names that might otherwise have been forgotten. Workers who died in mines. Children who never saw their parents again. Generations who lived and died in chains so that their descendants might be free. 100 years after liberation. A young girl visited the memorial of chains on Earth. She had grown up in a galaxy where humans traveled freely between stars, where her species was respected and feared and admired. She knew about the slavery years only from history lessons and stories told by elders. Her grandmother walked beside her, old now but still strong. She had been a child when the war ended. She remembered the celebrations and the tears. She remembered the older generation, the ones who had actually suffered, and how they had carried a weight that never fully lifted. The girl looked at the endless lists of names and asked what slavery had been like. Her grandmother thought for a long moment. She thought of Elena Vasquez, who had passed messages in the mines and died without knowing she had helped change history. She thought of Marcus Stone, who had wanted nothing more than a quiet life and got a war instead. She thought of the billions who had not survived to see freedom. It was the darkness before the dawn, she finally said. And you, my dear, are the light that came after. She took her granddaughter's hand, and together they walked through the memorial. Above them, human ships crossed the sky on their way to distant worlds. Behind them, the names of the dead gleamed in the sunlight. Humanity had been broken once. They had been scattered and enslaved and nearly destroyed, but they had endured. They had fought, and in the end, they had risen. The stars belonged to them now, not as masters, but as equals, not as conquerors, but as builders, and they would never forget what it had cost to get there.